So we have a situation where good vocabulary knowledge helps students to read. Okay, that means they can understand texts well if they've got good vocabulary knowledge. So if they understand text well, that means that they can read more. And of course, the more they read, the more they can develop their vocabulary knowledge. Okay, so looking at these steps, another way of perceiving this is what I would call a causal circle. So again, you start with vocabulary knowledge, as you can see on the left-hand side. Then that aids comprehension. So if students understand well, they can read more, which means they get more input and therefore they develop vocabulary knowledge. So this reading does really help in that way. But the question is, how do they read? And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at some strategies later on. But before we do that, I'd like to now move on to the second part of the webinar, where we're looking at the kind of vocabulary learning that students can do. So I've ABC down to F. I've described 6 different activities, and I'd like you to decide whether each activity involves incidental vocabulary learning, where it's not planned, or whether it is deliberate vocabulary learning of some kind. So, for example, number A, pre-teaching vocabulary. This is where the teacher chooses to pre-teach some words before doing maybe a reading or a listening text. I would see that as deliberate vocabulary instruction. So what I'd like you to do is comment on the rest. And you can just type in the letters and put I or D next to each letter. So I'll just pause for 30 seconds or so that you can do that. Okay, so we're getting lots of replies. Fantastic. Thank you very much. And it looks like, yeah, there's a lot of agreement in terms of the kind of learning that takes place. Okay, so let's move on and have a look at, this is what I felt. So hearing a new word in conversation, incidental. Guessing the meaning of a new word during extensive reading. So this is when maybe a learner is reading an article or maybe a graded reader. So that's incidental. Clarifying new words with a specific lexical set. This is where the teachers may be, I don't know, teaching words together with health words for sickness and health. Getting students to notice collocations and corpus examples. So that's more focused and therefore more deliberate. And then an online news story that would be incidental. So what I'd like you to do now is answer this question. What is your opinion? Do you think that incidental learning and deliberate instruction are completely different ways of focusing on vocabulary? Or do you think that there is some kind of connection? Okay. So just about everybody is saying no, there is some connection. Some people are saying they're different. Okay, so obviously this is what's not a trick question, but I think both the yeses and the nos are right, and this is why I think so. I think that one difference that we can note here is that incidental learning is more learner-centered. So it's often when students are reading or listening or hearing words and noticing in some way. Whereas deliberate instruction is more directed by the teacher. So it's where the teacher has an aim in mind in terms of teaching Lexis, and they make a definite decision. However, Paul Nation says quite clearly that they are complementary activities and each one does enhance the learning that comes from the other. And I would certainly agree with that. Research shows that reading accompanied by deliberate learning activities results in better vocabulary learning than reading by itself. So what is interesting about this quote from Paul Nation is the fact that often teachers do feel that students need to assume most of the responsibility for learning vocabulary. Okay, so that in effect they almost hand over that responsibility and say, well, you can read, you can study words. This is something that you can do through independent learning. So what Paul Nation is saying here is that is true, but if it's supported by learning activities that help that process, it will be more effective. So how can we do that? So there are two key ways, I think, and this is what I'm going to look at in the latter part of the webinar, is first of all, we need to provide students with strategies so that their incidental learning is more effective. So in effect, we need to train them how to notice. So I'm going to look at some specific examples of how we can do that later on. By the same token, we can provide direct vocabulary instruction with the aim of broadening and deepening the lexical knowledge that students have. I've got some more ideas that I can show you later in the session for how we can do that in the classroom, where we're actually supporting students in that way. But before we do that, I'd like to just step back a little bit and look at what it means to actually know what a word, to actually understand a word completely. So we can look at the form of a word, the way it's made. We can obviously need to look at the meaning of a word, what a word will actually mean. And we also need to look at the way that a word is used. Now, from A to F, there are 6 questions. And what I'd like you to do is try and match these questions to the three different categories of form, meaning, and use. So, for example, in question A, what is included in the concept? Obviously, that relates to the meaning. The concept of the word is the meaning of the word. Okay, B, what does the word sound like? That would relate to the form of the word. So now try C, D, E, F, if you can match it to those categories. So again, I'll just pause a moment while you do that. Great, lots of answers. That's fantastic. So there are about 280 people, so I'm having to pause a little bit so to give you all an opportunity to answer. But fantastic, your answers are really good. So thank you for your wonderful participation. Okay, so let's have a look at the answers. So I'll just give you a moment to read those. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each category and look at the individual questions and just tease out exactly what I mean. And I'll give you some examples. And just in case some of the questions aren't entirely clear, or maybe some of the answers aren't entirely clear. So just while we're pausing while you read that, these questions I got from Paul Nation's book, Learning Vocabulary in Another Language, which is a very big book, but it is a fantastic resource if you're interested in vocabulary learning. This is kind of like the Bible. Paul Nation, he in fact is also a New Zealander, like myself. He's worked for most of his academic life working on vocabulary, and his book is kind of the net result, and it's a fantastic resource. So he actually includes even more questions and more categories. And if you're interested in exploring this more, I would highly recommend his book. So let's just look at what I mean. How is the word written and spelled? Okay, so here the fact that in English we, for example, nationalities, we use a capital letter. So I know in other languages like Italian, they don't. In Italian, nationalities don't have a capital letter. It can include little things like environment. I mean, this is something that native speakers will often get wrong. They will often forget to include the N when they write it and misspell it. So it's knowing that kind of thing. Because obviously, when we say environment, the N is really not pronounced. So this can often lead to a spelling mistake. But then we can look at it from the other way round. So we have these these four letters, O-U-G-H in English, and the spelling is always the same, but the pronunciation always changes. So cough, we've got the O sound, so O-U-G-H is with a vowel sound O, whereas in although, the vowel sound is O. So there are other, like through, thorough, there are other words that form part of this kind of group. So the sound of a word, knowing how we say it, is part of the form. What's included in the concept? So if we look at the phrase awkward situation, sorry, I've just noted someone wanted the name of the book. I've actually got references at the end in the final slide. So I'll put that final slide up at the end. So don't worry, we will get there. Don't worry about that. So if we look at the phrase awkward situation, now people look at the word awkward and often think that awkward means difficult. But we wouldn't talk about an awkward exam. So that meaning doesn't sort of work. And in fact, to get the meaning of awkward across, we need to say that it's difficult and embarrassing. So if we just say, oh, awkward means difficult, that doesn't actually fully include the concept of that word, okay? So you actually need to say awkward means difficult and embarrassing. That is the full concept. Then this question here is a little bit trickier. What word form can be used to express this meaning? So here I've given a meaning, and the meaning is shaking because of the cold. Okay, so if someone actually said that, the idea is perfectly clear. You know, I was shaking because it was so cold. However, we actually do have a precise word in that, and the word is shiver. So knowing that we can use the word shiver, which is a more succinct way, a more economical way of saying shaking because of the cold, that's also part of vocabulary knowledge. Then, what patterns that we can use? So, for example, the first example here, from point of view. So we always need from point of view, but then we would put some kind of adjective or adjective phrase in the middle. So understanding that actual frame, that pattern that we can use, and that we need to use the preposition from with point of view. So that's and also point of view is a whole complete phrase. And then finally, we can look at the way in which we use words in different situations or contexts. So a mother and maybe a very young child might talk about an upset tummy, whereas more neutrally, people might just talk about having indigestion, whereas a doctor in a medical report might talk about dyspepsia. Now, in effect, those things are all the same things, but we use different vocabulary in different situations. So that is also part of use. So as I mentioned in Paul Nation's book, he's got even more categories. So if you're interested in looking at this in more detail, I would recommend looking at his book. So in summary, knowing a word, in fact, is quite a complex process. It's not just about knowing the definition. It's also knowing about pronunciation, spelling, how you use it with other words, what is appropriate or not. We also need to think about the fact that knowing a word can be both receptive and productive. So some words, perhaps we only need to be able to understand. We may not necessarily want to use, whereas other words, it's important that we need to be able to use them. So that will depend on the context in which people are trying to use English. And the key point here is that learners often need guidance on what to focus on. So that's what I want to have a look at. So this comment from Hirsch, he talks about this idea of students noticing vocabulary. So when they are listening to something or reading something, they will often notice particular words and they will often get interested. And that means that they will perhaps, there might be a glossary that they can look at, or they might use a dictionary or something along those lines. So let's look at this thing of noticing. Research supports a number of strategies for learning vocabulary. The further benefit of strategy learning is that students can continue learning on their own if they are motivated to do so. So, in effect, students will notice vocabulary, but the way in which they notice it is not always efficient and doesn't always lead to good learning. So what Grabe is suggesting here is that it's useful if students have got very specific strategies for when they notice vocabulary. So that's what I want to have a look at. At the end of last year, so in order to do that, I'm going to give you a fairly precise example from my own teaching. For the last term of last year, I was teaching a B1 level class. I was actually using the course book that I worked on, Cambridge English and Power. All the students in the class had a reader. So at the school I work for in Auckland, we have a learning centre. We have an independent study learning centre, and we have quite a lot of readers. And I asked all learners to actually get a reader. And I made sure they had one. I went to the learning centre and made sure they had one. And I helped them select it if they didn't have one. So, so we used the reader sometimes in class. But, excuse me, but then I wanted to actually show students how they could use their reader effectively when they were noticing new words as they were reading. So what I did was I chose a reader and I got them to read the first chapter so that everyone was reading the same story, because it was obviously difficult to do this given that they were all reading different books. So there was one book where I got them to read the first chapter. And this is the book I chose. My reason for choosing it is because, well, it looked quite interesting. It's a kind of quite an interesting story. It's a kind of a mixture of comedy. It's kind of a mystery story. There's a little bit of suspense, but it's about a couple and who kind of are not communicating terribly well. And this mystery man, arrives one day and offers to do the ironing. And so that accounts for the title, The Ironing Man. Okay, so in the second chapter of The Ironing Man, I read the first chapter at home. That was a homework activity. Then I got them to read the second chapter in class. And the reason for that, there was some particular vocabulary in the second chapter that I wanted to focus on because that was useful in terms of teaching them strategies for noticing. So this paragraph here is an excerpt from The Ironing Man. And obviously the two words I've highlighted here are the words shake. So first of all, it's used as a verb, and in the second, it's used as an adjective. So in this particular segment, this is what the woman is imagining as she goes. She's heard a knock at the door. In fact, it's the ironing man who's knocking at the door. But as she walks towards the door, she's having this kind of fantasy about a young woman who's going to answer the door. But in fact, there's nothing terrible happens. It's just her imagination. So, but what I was particularly interested in terms of teaching my learners strategies was focusing on these two uses of shake. So here's another little quiz for you to think about. How many different meanings do you think there are of the word shake? So do you think there are 4 different meanings, 7, 8, or 10? So just think for a moment, maybe think of a few examples and have a guess. How many meanings do you think there are for the word shake in English? Okay, we're getting around sort of the 7, 8 mark. No, it's quite a range. Some people are saying 10, some people are saying 4. Okay, I'll just pause a minute to give most people a chance to type in their answer. Fantastic. Okay, so here is the answer. So these definitions I have taken from the Cambridge Dictionary Online. And the Cambridge Dictionary Online is a free resource. You just have to, all you need is the internet and type in Cambridge Dictionary Online, and learners can use it, you can use it. One of the benefits of the Cambridge Dictionary Online is that a lot of the vocabulary is tagged in terms of its CEFR level. So you can notice that I've, next to each meaning, I've given the CFR level, B1, B2, etc. Okay. So these are the 8 different meanings for shake. And if you'd like to see more examples and details, what you can do after the webinar is log into the Cambridge Dictionary Online, and they can give you more detail, more examples. But I'm going to show you some examples now. So this is when you do a search for shake in the Cambridge Dictionary Online. This is what you get. This is kind of the initial page. Okay. And this is not all of the meanings. This is just the first page. It goes down further to get all 8. So here is the first meaning that was in the text. So this idea of moving backwards and forwards. Okay, so this is about the tree shaking. And then if we look at the second, if your voice shakes, it makes you sound nervous or frightened. This was the second meaning in the Ironing Man text. So this is a C2 level meaning, a slightly higher one, but that's okay. So a key thing though is here, it's being used as a verb, but in the text it was used as an adjective. So an adjective has been made from the verb, but it's with this meaning of nervousness. So this is what students are, this is what they have to kind of deal with if they are looking at an online dictionary like the Cambridge Dictionary Online. So this, what I'm showing you now, is a task that I gave them. So first of all, I got them to underline the 2 words so that they kind of identified them. And before I did anything else, I got them to look at the words in context and to decide whether they were a noun, a verb, or an adjective, or an adverb. So they had to identify the fact the first use was shake as a verb, and in the second use, it was shake as an adjective. Then I got them to look at the different meanings of shake from the online dictionary and got them to match the meanings to the examples. Now, not all of the students got the answers right, and that's not important. The issue here is not being right or wrong. It's just getting them to think about the fact that it's not, because what students will often do, they will just look at the first meaning and then not look any further. So my aim in doing this was to get them to realize the fact that there were lots of different meanings, so they needed to look at those. So I wasn't worried if they got the wrong answer. That wasn't important. The next step is I got them to look at whether shake was a regular or irregular verb, because that information is provided in the dictionary. Then I got them to notice this grammar pattern, the wind shakes the trees. Okay, so what are the different, so I got them to look at the entry. There were more examples in the online entry. So I got them to identify what other things, not the wind, but what other subjects were there. And then not the trees, what other objects were there. So that got them to look at different nouns that shake would collocate with in terms of what can shakes, what can shake, and what can be shaken, in effect. So it focused on that kind of information. It also highlights the fact that the verb shake in this particular use is transitive. So those were some activities that I did in class. Then I gave students this handout at the end of the lesson. So this is something that they could take home with them so that when they were actually doing their reading, they could actually refer to this worksheet and follow these suggestions in terms of trying to notice vocabulary more effectively. So if there was a word that they noticed and they wanted to find out more about, what I suggested is that they study the different meanings and they match one of the meanings to the meanings of the word in the story that they were reading. Then, as a strategy to help them slightly broaden their vocabulary knowledge, what I suggested was that, okay, you've looked at one meaning for that word. If there are 2 or 3 other meanings, why not learn that meaning as well? So this is aiming to increase their vocabulary knowledge. Then what I suggested, because often students think, well, there are these 5 different meanings of the word, and I've looked at one, so there are another 4. Which one should I learn? And this is where the Cambridge Dictionary Online is very helpful, because it does tag the words according to the CFR level. So I said, well, if you're not sure which meaning to learn, look for the B1 level meanings, because that probably is going to be the most useful and the most helpful for you at this stage in your language development. Then I suggested that they look at examples in the dictionary and try and work out what words go together with the word that they're focusing on. So, for example, if they are looking at verbs, so what nouns that would go together with the verbs. If it was an adjective, what nouns that the adjective can go together with, or vice versa, and things like prepositions that come after a verb. So encouraging students not to look at just the word that they're worried about, but to look at maybe what's happening before and after the word. So if the new word is a verb, so this was a specific strategy for verbs, make sure that you check the simple past and the past participle forms. Is it regular or is it irregular? So if it's irregular, in their vocabulary notebook, they should, in fact, they should note that down. They should also study the examples and find out if an object comes after the verb. I didn't look, in the dictionary, it does actually it has V and I to indicate transitivity or not. Because it was a B1 level class, I didn't want to kind of give them too much meta language. So I just used this term of object rather than saying, is it transitive? So this were just 4 simple tips that I gave to students as a kind of a handout for when they were reading their readers at home and noticing particular words. So as a teacher, I'm fairly realistic. I'm not saying that all 14 of my students suddenly started noticing far more actively. But after I taught this particular lesson, what I noticed is in the next 2 or 3 weeks, that some of the students were coming up to me at the end of the lesson and they were checking vocabulary with me. So they were looking and noticing far more actively. And occasionally there were 1 or 2 things that they weren't sure about and they were checking with me. I think it's this, but I'm not sure. So that was really encouraging for me to know that they actually were beginning to use these strategies, some of them, and they were engaging with the vocabulary in a slightly more proactive way. So when we talk about vocabulary, we often tend to think about individual words, but it is also worth remembering that a lot of vocabulary is perceived as chunks or lexical strings of language. So this is a definition from a book by Leo Sullivan that came out last year, which looks at vocabulary chunks. And he said a chunk is a frequently recurring meaningful string of 2 or more words, either fixed or with variable slots, which can be learned as a single unit without the need to analyze its elements. So if you're interested in the whole issue of vocabulary chunks, I would again recommend his book, and it's in the references at the end of that will be at the end of the webinar. And not only does he give background, but he gives lots of really useful practical ideas. So coming back to the Ironing Man, from the chapter 2 that I dealt with in class, there were these 2 little chunks of vocabulary, in effect a kind of collocation pattern, that I focused on with learning. So do your ironing for you and to make a wish. So again, here is an activity that I got students to do. underline the words ironing and wish. Are these words nouns or adjectives? What verbs go together with them, etc. So just highlighting the fact that ironing and wish, we'd say do the ironing but make a wish. And then posing them the question. So what is better to write in your vocabulary notebook? Is it better to write just the word wish? Or is it better to actually record the whole phrase, make a wish, when you say you want something? So to focus on this idea of vocabulary chunks. And again, the reader had these two examples. So this was one more activity that I did with students in class, just to get them focused on the idea that sometimes when they're looking at vocabulary, it's not just the word, but it's a whole phrase or chunk that they need to focus on, and also that they need to make a record of in their vocabulary books. So those were some of the strategies that I dealt with when I was teaching this group at the end of last year. But then at the same time, I also wanted to try and extend the range of vocabulary that these learners had. So I just want to show you another practical idea that I used, which is, again, like the Cambridge Dictionary Online, it's using a freely available resource that can help you. So in Unit 8 of Cambridge English Empower, it focuses on the topic of entertainment. So it's talking about art, music, literature. So there's a lot of entertainment vocabulary. So you can see in exercise 1A, there is a lexical set there looking at art and music. So what I was interested in doing is amplifying this a little bit. So I used the free resource that I used is English Profile. So English Profile is it's a resource that includes a lot of vocabulary which has been tagged to see if levels, and you can do different searches in English Profile. So, for example, in my case, I wanted to do a search on all the words to do with entertainment at B1 level. So if you go into English Profile, you're able to do this. And this will show you what is learnable for learners at a specific level. So I, in fact, did a search, and what I found when I did the search is that a lot of the entertainment words in English Profile at B1 level were, in fact, nouns. And in fact, the search that I did resulted in almost about 70 odd words at B1 level, 70 nouns. I'm just showing you the first sort of selection. So what I did is I did a search, and I copied and pasted that onto a worksheet, all of the nouns at B1 level associated with entertainment. And I gave that as a handout to learners. So the idea was not that they learned all the words on the handout. I wanted them to focus on words that they were interested in, because Schmidt makes a very good point here when he says that if a learner engages with a new word, in other words, if they're kind of interested in it, that they're curious in some way, then they're kind of going to be more likely to learn it. So I gave students this handout, the word list. This is the idea for including range. And what I asked them to do at home is to go through and tick the words that they knew, because they already knew a lot of these words. They weren't of the 70 odd words, they weren't all new. They knew a lot of them, maybe about 60–70% of the words they already knew. But then I got them to choose 6 to 8 new words that they were interested in learning. So they sort of said, which words should I learn? And I sort of said, well, look up some of them, learn the ones that you think are interesting, that you think are going to be. So that's looking at Schmidt's idea that if it's interesting, learners are more likely to learn the words. Then the next day in class, I got students to come back. I put them into small groups, and I just got them to report back to each other on the 6 to 8 words that they had chosen. And then from each group, they selected the 3 or 4 words that were most popular within their group, and then we created a class list of the 8 most popular words from the class as a whole, from the initial 70. So this was just a very simple way of getting learners to learn a few more words, by talking about them together and sharing them with each other, that meant that they were using the words, they were referring to the meaning, they were getting more practice in using them, and then creating this class list together. So this is a way of extending their range. And then in terms of doing some kind of extra practice, I created a Quizlet, which is a freely available resource. You can create online vocabulary cards. So one of the words that the class wanted to learn as a whole was interval. And so you have the definition on one side, and then you have the word on the other. And we were using a very sort of simple learning management system, and I uploaded the Quizlet quiz into our learning management system for the class, and they could go in there and practice the words that we looked at using Quizlet to do further practice and revision of the vocabulary. So that was just a very simple way, doing a search from English Profile, creating a list, getting learners to actually choose the words that they want to learn, and this just extended the range of lexical items that we focused on beyond those in the course book. So that's an example of deliberate teacher-led vocabulary teaching. Finally, another resource that's available. Again, it's free. Well, there is a free version, and there's I think also a paying version of Wordable. Wordable is an app that students can download onto their mobile phone, and you, the teacher, can as well. And this is a wonderful opportunity of sort of playing games to practice vocabulary. So it's based on the vocabulary that you can find on the Cambridge Dictionary Online, which again is tagged to the CFR levels. And when learners actually download the app, they can indicate what their level is. It provides games for individuals, but there are also competitions that they can play with each other in class, or they can actually do it with people who they don't know on the other side of the world, maybe even in New Zealand. Sorry, my voice is getting a little bit tired. So there are lots of games, some of them where they have to match to pictures. There are spelling games, they're given clues. But also there are translation activities, which are quite good, because when students register, they are asked to indicate what their first language is. So there are also translation activities. But the thing is that everything is a game, and particularly for learners who like learning in a technological environment of some kind, they respond very, very well to Wordable. So we have got more or less to the end. So I'd just like to sum up by saying that students can learn a lot of vocabulary by reading, but at the same token, they need a wide vocabulary knowledge to read fluently. So it's as I mentioned before, it's a causal circle. Graded readers, I think, are probably the best way of doing that, particularly for learning incidental vocabulary. And because remember, we had that figure of Paul Nations of 95%. So a graded reader, yes, it's far easier for students to understand, but by the same token, there's always new vocabulary for them to learn in a graded reader. One thing that we need to do as teachers, and I've showed you some examples here, I'm not saying that you necessarily need to do what I did, but something along those lines which actually helps students to notice vocabulary as they are reading and using readers. By the same token, we can also use a lot of freely available resources to slightly broaden and deepen students' vocabulary knowledge. So things like English Profile, and also using the Cambridge Dictionary Online, that we can do this in the classroom, set very simple tasks where students help each other learn new words, share those words with each other, and we can then create class lists. So we have come to the end, and as I promised, the references are here. So a lot of you, I think, were very interested in the Paul Nation, ISB Nation, learning vocabulary in another language. So that is there. And I think some of you are also quite interested in the the vocabulary chunks, lexical grammar by Leo Sullivan. That's the final list there. But also, if you're interested in vocabulary and reading, the William Gray book is also very good.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Can people hear me? Sorry about the sound at the end there.
Thank you very much. Can people hear me? Sorry about the sound at the end there.
Can anybody hear me? I'm very sorry about the
you,
sound at the end there. You can hear me.
Can anybody hear me? I'm very sorry
Good.
about this.
Good. Okay, there's a bit of a delay there. Apologies just for the ending there, but thank you very much for Craig for the rest of that. I think that was very interesting, and we had a lot of comments. And thank you for joining in there with the activities. If you do have any questions, you can put them in now. I see that it's a nice community today. People are sending each other links. People are inviting each other to meet. I mean, that's up to you if you want to put your connection sort of information in there. That, I mean, we're all adults. That's fine, but obviously you understand if other people write to you. But thank you very much for that. It's great to see that people are helping each other out there. So. A question that we had from Haneke is, can we use English Profile that you spoke about before? Is that a free resource for people to use?
Yes, it is. All you need to do is register. So if you go to English Profile, and English Profile, there's a grammar profile and a vocabulary profile. So you need to go to the vocabulary profile. And you.
Can you hear me? Do you want to just use?
I can hear you, Simon.
Hi everyone. I've just taken over Simon's microphone because there seems to be a problem with mine. So in answer to the question about English Profile, yes, it's freely available. You just need to go to the English Vocabulary Profile or English Profile Vocabulary website, you register, and that will give you a login. And then
register, and that will give you a login. And then
basically from that moment on, it's freely available.
And then basically from that moment on, it's freely available.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question. So yes, someone has asked a question whether I think that students enjoy reading more if they don't have to look up words that often. Exactly, and this is really the aim of graded readers, so that students do understand most of the text, and they're having to do far less looking up of words. So this is where William Graves' figure of students being able to understand 95% of a text is really important, because if it's only 90% of the text, and there are a lot of words that students are having to look up, that's obviously have a negative effect on their fluency, their reading fluency. So yes, I would agree with that. But by the same token, it is good if students do look up one or two words as a way of developing their vocabulary knowledge. So I'll just scroll down and I think games for pre-teaching is, so the question was, are there any games for pre-teaching vocabulary? I don't tend to play games when I pre-teach vocabulary, because in effect my aim there is to get the meaning of new words across, because I want students to understand a word for a reading text or maybe a listening text, or maybe I want students to be able to use one or two keywords in a speaking activity. I think that games and vocabulary learning is more, the aim of games really is to practice vocabulary. And if you think of it in that light, there's an endless number of games, from, you know, crossword puzzles, backs to the board, miming, having vocabulary on cards and matching meanings to definitions and things like that. I think there's a kind of an endless number of games, but I see that games as being about practicing vocabulary rather than actually the pre-teaching, because in the pre-teaching the aim really is to convey the meaning as efficiently as possible, but also to focus on the pronunciation and spelling and things like that. Okay. So the question is, how can we focus on accuracy and fluency at an advanced level when reading text? I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, because I see that accuracy and fluency as being very much about students using vocabulary, whereas reading a text is about students understanding vocabulary. I mean, you could, if you're looking at reading and accuracy, I guess what you would be wanting to suggest there is that students are understanding the meanings of words in a correct and accurate way. That is quite a difficult thing to track, because because in order to do that, you need to measure whether students are understanding maybe particular words in the way that they should. And I think probably the only way that you can do that is by going through a text, anticipating the words that you think are going to be difficult for your learners, and then thinking of concept questions that you can ask them to check whether they have understood correctly. But it's particularly if you've got a group of, say, 15 or 20 students, it's very difficult to understand or to know who is understanding well or not understanding well in light of particular words. In terms of practicing vocabulary, using vocabulary, to try and do accuracy and fluency at the same time is quite difficult. You can do things like give students a speaking activity, give them a card, and you can maybe put 3 or 4 words that you want them to use on the card, and make the aim of the activity saying, I want you to speak as much as possible, but I want you to try and use these 3 or 4 words. So that's trying to give them a little bit of an accuracy focus in terms of using that vocabulary, but also trying to get them to speak fluently at the same time. So the question that Simon just mentioned was, is it better to pre-teach vocabulary for the whole text or section by section? I think that entirely depends on the length of the text. So I think, yes, if the text is very long, there is an argument for breaking that up. But by the same token, I don't think you'd want to break it up too much. So, I mean, for example, you wouldn't want to do it on a paragraph by paragraph basis, because obviously you want to give students an opportunity to be able to read a decent stretch of text with a degree of fluency. So it's difficult to kind of give a blanket answer to that one. It is a very good question, but I think it's very much a question of a judgment call in terms of the length of the text that you're dealing with. Certainly, if you're teaching English for academic purposes, where the texts are longer, I think that there is an argument for pre-teaching step by step or stage by stage.
Great, thank you very much. I think that's about all that we have time for. There's some nice comments coming through, which I'm sure Craig can read now. Thanks very much for attending today. That's all we've got time for, but don't forget to check on the events page for any further webinars that we have, and you can visit that at cambridge.org/ELT events. And a recording of today's webinar should be live on our blog and YouTube channel next week. And please don't forget to download the certificate from the screen, which you can see on the screen in the bottom right hand corner now. So that's, as I say, all we have time for today. We'll leave that certificate on just for a couple of minutes, But thank you again for attending, and I hope you enjoyed it. And Craig's saying thank you because he hasn't got his headset on anymore, but he's saying thank you. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.